Aloha! I'm totally thrilled about having Richard Heinberg with us. You know, as a campus, we're moving towards campus sustainability. Richard is moving the world towards sustainability in a different form of being on the planet. In our initiatives here at Hawaii Pacific University, fortunately last year we were able to hire a part-time campus sustainability coordinator. That position is now a full-time position, and the person in it is Josh Prigge. Some of you know Josh, but if you don't know him, I want to introduce him to you briefly, and Josh will then introduce our guest, Richard Heinberg. So Josh, stand up and let's give it Josh a hand.
So that's easier. Thank you all for coming. We're very, very excited to have Richard here. Like Art said, I'm the Sustainability Coordinator here. I graduated from the Global Leadership and Sustainable Development Program that Art is the program chair for. I was telling Richard on the way over here, The Party's Over was a book that I really loved. I recommended it to a number of people. It's a book that Richard wrote a few years back. And it's actually a book that Art recommended to me as I was joining the program. It's about peak oil and the need to transition to a world without fossil fuels. Like a lot of Richard's book, it's very interesting, very eye-opening, based on facts. Just a really good piece of work, as is the End of Growth here. Beyond writing many books, Richard presents across the country, in dozens of countries around the world. He's been in a number of documentaries, and he's considered one of the world leaders in peak oil education, and a very effective communicator of our need to transition to a world without fossil fuels. So I'm very, very excited to present Richard Heinberg. Please welcome Richard.
Thank you. Well, aloha. What a beautiful place. I can see why you live here. Well, what I'd like to do over the course of the next 45, 50 minutes is talk to you about my new book, The End of Growth, and then we'll have plenty of time after that, at least half an hour, for questions and discussion. I started the book in some ways back in 2008 when we had the big oil price spike and the collapse of the near collapse of Wall Street. In some ways, I started the book many years earlier. I think I was 21 years old when I first read a book called The Limits to Growth, which was the best-selling environmental book still of all time. And at that time, in 1972, I realized for the first time in my life that I was living in a society that was on a track that was fundamentally unsustainable. That the way things were going could not be maintained for very long. Now, what does that mean for very long? Well, it could mean centuries, could mean decades, could mean years. Clearly, world economic growth has continued up until virtually the present. I make the argument in my book that we are now in a transition period away from economic growth, and it's not being driven by policy, it's not being driven by people rising up and saying, oh, we don't want any more economic growth. It's being driven by events having to do with the environment and with the financial system. So let's unpack this. I'm going to argue that growth, economic growth worldwide is ending due to three factors. And I call it the 3 Ds: debt, depletion, and disaster. And I'm going to argue that each of these categories of events is directly or indirectly related to our reliance on fossil fuels. Okay, so why fossil fuels? What's the big deal about fossil fuels? Well, fossil fuels have created the world that we live in, the cultural and social and economic world that we take for granted. For 99% and more of our history as a species, we relied on renewable energy sources. Firewood, crops. We used muscle power in order to change our environment and get the things that we needed. But just a couple of hundred years ago, that changed. We developed certain tools and technologies, metallurgy, gears, simple heat engine, the steam engine. And those few simple inventions enabled us to extract and harness fossil fuels, which actually we had known about earlier, but we hadn't really had any effective way of using them. But once we began using fossil fuels, it was as though the genie was out of the bottle. Maybe you've had the experience of running out of gas in your car and having to push your car off to the side of the road. That's hard work, especially if it's a big car. Imagine pushing your car, let's say 20 or 30 miles. That's really a lot of work. That's the equivalent of maybe 3 months of hard labor. Okay, well, we get that done for us from a single gallon of gasoline for which we're paying $4 and complaining. Think about that. 3 months worth of human labor for $4. You can't get labor that cheap in China or India or anywhere else. That's why we have mechanized every process of production and transport that we possibly could over the course of the last century or so. Fossil fuels have given us an economic miracle. This is GDP per capita. Now, GDP growth is what we're really talking about here. It's the increase in the size of the economy, how much money is being spent in aggregate. And if you look at GDP over human history, there really wasn't very much growth. The idea that economies always grow is really a very recent idea. And it's an idea that's become implanted in our collective psyche just in the last century, really. A century of rapid economic growth due to the availability of fossil fuels. Now, this is per capita GDP growth. Now, during this same period of time, we were adding a lot more capitas. Human population was increasing from fewer than 1 billion at the start of the Industrial Revolution to 7 billion today. That's 7 times over in just a couple of hundred years. Extraordinary rate of population growth. I guess you could say that's extraordinary biological success for our species. How did we achieve it? Well, largely through fossil fuels, through better sanitation. But if you trace back what was going on with improvements in sanitation, most of those related indirectly to fossil fuels. And then the ability to produce more food and to transport resources further distances from where they're abundant to where they're scarce. Altogether, it's enabled us to increase Earth's carrying capacity for human beings. The big question of our lifetimes will be, was that a temporary increase in carrying capacity, or can it be made permanent? I don't know the answer to that question, but it's a pretty important one. Well, here in the US, and of course I'm talking mostly about the continental US, the continental US was the epicenter of all of this economic growth because there were so many fossil fuels there: oil, coal, natural gas. The oil industry got started there. Other technologies really took root, like the automobile industry, the aircraft industry, and so on, because there were the cheap fuels to make those things go. So the problem in the early 20th century was actually one of overproduction. Using cheap fossil fuels, we could make stuff faster than people could buy it. So how did we solve that problem of overproduction? Well, in two ways. One was advertising, and of course I have a car ad here because the automobile was emblematic of the kinds of developments we're talking about. Using mass production assembly lines, it was possible to make cars in such numbers that everybody could own one, right? But in 1910, not everybody wanted to own a car or even thought it was possible because these were big ticket items. They cost, like $950 for a Model T in 1910. It doesn't sound like a lot of money today, but in 1910, in dollars of that era, that was a lot. So using advertising, we were able to talk people into wanting these things, and that included some sub-strategies like planned obsolescence, making things so that they would reliably break down after a short period of time so you'd have to replace them, or changing the appearance of consumer objects so everybody would want the latest model. Okay, that was one strategy for solving the problem of overproduction. The other strategy was consumer credit, making it possible to buy big ticket items on credit to pay over a long period of time. So effectively increasing debt. Okay? Now, this again was a very effective strategy. But what it did was it led to increasing levels of debt, consumer debt, corporate debt, and so on. Now, as all of this was happening, the idea that the economy would continue to grow virtually forever became embedded again in our collective psyche. We even transitioned our monetary system. Money used to be linked to precious metals, gold and silver. But there was only so much gold and silver around. Meanwhile, we were capable of growing the economy with cheap, concentrated fossil fuels so rapidly that we couldn't dig enough we couldn't dig enough gold and silver out of the ground to make the economy grow as quickly as we otherwise could. So we disentangled money from precious metals. It happened gradually over the course of a century, but the final link was cut back in 1971. So what is money if it's not gold or silver? Well, it's debt. All of our money is debt. It's loaned into existence. When you go into a bank and take out a loan, the banker doesn't go into the vault and search around on the shelves. Let's say you're taking out a $10,000 loan. He doesn't search around on the shelves for $10,000 that somebody put there and doesn't have any use for right now. What happens is that the banker goes to her or his computer, makes a few keystroke entries, and suddenly there's $10,000 in your account. That $10,000 didn't exist previously. It's called into existence at the moment that the loan is made. And the moment you repay that loan, the $10,000 ceases to exist. It's magic. And it works, more or less, as long as the economy is growing. Why is economic growth important? Well, because when the banker makes that $10,000 loan, he or she does not at the same time create the extra money to enable you to make the interest payments on that loan. So where does the interest come from? Well, it comes from other people elsewhere in the economy also taking out loans, and then we all do business with each other, we get jobs, we sell stuff, and as long as more people are always taking out more loans, then on average, there's enough new money being created so that those interest payments can be made and defaults can be avoided. So in effect, perpetual growth is the collateral for debt, for existing debt. Okay, once again, this more or less worked through the 20th century, and especially it worked up until the 1980s. But in the 1980s, something began to change. Prior to that time, GDP growth and growth in debt were occurring at about the same rate. In other words, we were creating just enough new money to fund all of the new economic activity that was occurring. Starting in the 1980s, globalization starts. So what happens with globalization? Companies in the US are outsourcing labor primarily to Asia. So American workers are starting to have to compete with low-wage workers in China, India, Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera. So this is putting downward pressure on wages in the US. Wages effectively, hourly wages for US workers effectively stagnate from that point on. Hourly wages for US workers are effectively no higher today than they were in 1980. So if the economy needs workers to buy more stuff, which it does, 70% of the economy by this time is consumer spending, okay? And if people want to buy more stuff because they're constantly being advertised at, we want to buy bigger houses and SUVs and flat screen TVs and handheld electronic devices and all this. We want all this stuff. How are we supposed to pay for it if our hourly wages are not increasing? Answer, more debt. So starting in the 1980s, debt increases faster than GDP. Okay? So that is the source of the financialization of the economy. You know, if you go into the bank and take out a loan, that's an obligation for you to repay that loan. But for the banker who's making the loan, that loan is an asset because that asset is going to pay off. It's going to pay a return by way of the interest. So as debt in the economy is increasing for the lenders, this is an increase in assets. So for Wall Street, starting in the 1980s, a giant pool of assets starts to appear. And so the question is how to manage these assets. And new financial instruments are created, mortgage-backed securities, derivatives. All of these are ways of taking this consumer debt and recycling it and leveraging it to the point where today, even though the US economy is only about $50 trillion per year, there are something like $500 trillion worth of derivatives that have been written on that economic activity. So here, that brings us up pretty much to the present, but not quite. Here you can see US total debt, consumer debt, corporate debt, debt within the financial system, and then government debt on top. We make a big deal out of government debt these days, and rightly so. It is an enormous problem. But government debt hasn't grown any faster than debt in these other categories, right? Until 2008. You notice right at the end of the chart, something strange happens. The trajectory changes. What happens there? Well, that's the 2008 financial crisis. And suddenly, debt in the private sector starts to disappear, not because everybody's paying off their loans, but because of defaults. Something like $6 trillion of value in American homeowners' primary asset, which is their homes, disappears almost overnight. $6 trillion worth of value as a result of plummeting home values. Well, for banks, of course, this means that a lot of the debt that they have written on the back of those home mortgages is now effectively worthless. Home equity lines of credit, second mortgages, based on the value of those homes, these become what are known in the industry as toxic assets. And they're still being held on the books of the big Wall Street banks and hidden from view. Because if they were to come out into the light of day, it would be clear that most of the big Wall Street banks are in fact bankrupt. So what's happened since 2008 is that the government and the Federal Reserve, the quasi-private governmental entity that manages our monetary system, the Treasury and the Federal Reserve have attempted to keep the economy working by pumping literally trillions of dollars into it of new debt. So the new debt that's been created since 2008 is almost entirely in the government sector. This is net new debt. And prior to 2008, most of it was in the mortgage sector, and certainly in the private sector. Since 2008, net new debt has been almost entirely on the government side. I mentioned earlier this book that I read back in 1972, Limits to Growth. Well, what was this book anyway? It was an effort by a team of scientists to model the interaction between population growth, depletion of natural resources, and environmental impacts of industrial processes. So, of course, in 1972, they had very primitive computers, very primitive software, and very preliminary kinds of data. Nevertheless, when they did this computer modeling and scenario modeling exercise, the same thing kept coming up again and again, which was a scenario for world economic decline starting sometime in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. Now, of course, they tried to get rid of that result as best they could. They tried changing the input values to double natural resource availability, or to program in government programs to reduce population growth or to reduce environmental pollution. When they did these things, they were able to push industrial decline out by a decade or two. But the same fundamental result kept coming up again and again and again. Now, is it possible that the world debt crisis that we're seeing, not just in this country, but now exploding around the rest of the world, also in Greece and Ireland and Portugal and Italy, and now even in China, is related to this scenario exercise that was done 40 years ago? Well, I would argue yes. First of all, if all of this growth has been fundamentally based on fossil fuels, well, we know that fossil fuels are finite in quantity. So in principle, at some point, they start to get more expensive and difficult to get out of the ground. The fossil fuel age, whether it's 300 years or 400 years, we can argue about what the reserves are of coal or oil or natural gas, and what new technologies will be able to, will enable us to extract marginal sources and so on. Nevertheless, from a big picture point of view, it's going to look like this. Nobody disputes that. So the question is, where are we on that trajectory? Well, let's start with the United States. The US, as I said earlier, is really where this all started. It's where the oil industry started. We sometimes call ourselves the Saudi Arabia of coal. So how's the US doing with fossil fuels? Well, with oil, which is the most important of the fossil fuels because it's over 90% of our transport energy, while the US was the world's foremost oil producer and exporter in the early 20th century, by now we are by far the world's foremost oil importer. US oil production peaked in 1970. The vertical green bars are discoveries of oil. They peaked in 1930. So even though we're still finding oil in the US, we're finding less and less of it, and we're finding lower and lower grade, harder to get and more expensive to produce oil. And US oil production peaked in 1970. It's been declining ever since, generally speaking. Some years are better than others, but we're producing about 5.6 million barrels of oil per day now versus 10 million barrels of oil per day in 1970. This is what the discovery situation looks like globally. World oil discoveries peaked around 1964 and have generally been declining since then. Once again, it's not that we're not finding any oil, we're not running out of oil. What's happening is we're replacing reserves of easy to access, high quality oil, cheaply produced oil, with reserves of lower quality, more expensive to produce, slower to produce oil. And this is having an impact on actual rates of production, which is really what it's all about. We want to produce more oil with every passing year in order to have more economic growth, more transport, more travel, more tourism, and all the rest. Well, actual world crude oil production has been stuck in neutral since 2004. That's 7 years of plateau. Now, is that just because nobody wants any more oil? Well, actually, that's not the case. In fact, in China, there is rapidly growing demand for oil. So we've been seeing increasing demand, rising prices, and flat supply, which is a perfect opportunity for speculators who helped drive up the price back in 2008 and are helping again today. This is what the oil industry looked like back in the 1930s. This is what it looks like today. This is a slide from the US Department of Energy, Energy Information Administration. All of those nice colored bands are all the oil that we know about in the world. OPEC oil, non-OPEC oil, conventional oil, unconventional oil, tar sands, that's all of it. And you'll notice right around 2012 it starts dropping off. But not to worry, says the Department of Energy. The gap will be filled, we'll still have plenty, the gap will be filled by unidentified projects. Now, nobody knows what those unidentified projects are, but we trust that they'll appear just in time as soon as we need them. I would call this a faith-based energy policy. It's worked for us up till now. The question is, for how long will it continue to work? The situation we're facing right now is that world oil prices are effectively now a cap on US economic growth. In order to develop new oil production capacity, the costs to the industry are very high, much higher than they were just a decade ago. A decade ago, this first figure was more like $20. Today, and actually this slide is probably out of date. It probably should be something more like $87 per barrel is the price needed by the industry in order to justify development of new production capacity. Okay? But we know from recent economic history that every time the oil price gets up to around $100 a barrel and stays there in inflation-adjusted terms, the economy goes into recession. The vertical gray bars are historic recessions. The red squiggly line is oil prices. As you can see, every time there's been an oil price spike, a recession has followed. Now, we have had at least one recession that does not appear to be correlated with an oil price spike, but I don't see any oil price spikes there that aren't correlated with recessions. So here we are with the world oil price, once again up to about $110 a barrel, and we see the global economy struggling to achieve growth. This is not a temporary phenomenon. We have entered new economic territory, and it's going to have impact all the way up and down the line, especially for an island nation like Hawaii. Think how dependent you are on air travel. Well, what else can we use to fuel our planes besides oil? Maybe some kind of sophisticated biofuels, possibly so. That's going to be very expensive fuel. And we don't have lots of those new sophisticated biofuels all ready to go. Just pull up to the pump and thank you very much. No, that's going to take more years of research and development, and then it'll be a trade-off between those biofuels and food production. It's going to drive the price of food up, et cetera, et cetera. I could go on. Well, I mentioned food. We've created a food system globally, and especially in the US, that's very dependent on cheap liquid fuels, petroleum for transport of inputs to the farm, for transport of outputs from the farm ultimately to the consumer's plate. In the US in general, the average farm to plate travel distance is about 1,500 miles. What is it in Hawaii? Probably something closer to 2,500 miles. And how much of your food is imported? Maybe 85%, something like that. World food prices have begun moving in lockstep with oil prices because of the dependence of our food system on oil. Now, food prices are actually outpacing oil prices because there are some other factors that are entering into the equation, like weird weather. We'll get to that more in a moment. But the social impact of high fuel prices and high food prices is hitting countries around the world, especially poor countries with a young population and a fast-growing population where there aren't that many jobs. So young people who are facing life with no job, no prospects of a job, and soaring food prices, what would you do in that situation other than go out in the street and protest? And so we've seen that in North Africa, in the Middle East. Now, of course, there was a political element to this. Many of these countries also had autocratic, repressive regimes, but those were regimes that people were willing to live with as long as their basic needs were met. When their basic needs are no longer being met, all bets are off. Now, depletion of resources is not just about oil. I focused largely on oil because I believe that that's a trigger resource. It's going to trigger the limits to growth phenomenon, if you will. Nevertheless, as long as we are gobbling up Earth's resources, it's basically just a series of dominoes waiting to fall. I have a list of other resources here that just happen to be useful in the computer industry and the renewable energy industry. Those are becoming rare as well and more costly. Now, up to about the year 2000, they were actually becoming cheaper. This is counterintuitive. If we're depleting these resources, how could they get cheaper? Well, it's because we were using more cheap energy to dig deeper and refine lower grade ores and globalize the whole process of resource exploration and extraction. Since about the year 2000, as energy has gotten more expensive, and especially oil, then that's driven up the price of all of these other commodities as well. Now, if energy is a problem, one could say, well, that's solvable. There are other sources of energy we could develop, so all we have to do is do that, and our problem is solved. Unfortunately, I have to tell you, it's not that easy. Yes, that is what we have to do, and that is what we will do, but it's not going to make the problem go away overnight. We did a study at Post Carbon Institute, and this is the cover page of that report, which you can download, by the way, for free, like all of our work, on postcarbon.org. And in this 75-page report, we looked at 18 different energy sources and examined them according to 10 criteria, including the energy that's returned on the energy that we invest in getting energy, the energy density of the resource, the location, the scalability, and so on. As far as I know, this is the only time this kind of study has been done, taking into account all 10 of these criteria. We couldn't identify a likely scenario in which world energy supplies will continue to grow as we deplete cheap fossil fuels. Oh, I mentioned weird weather earlier. That's also related to fossil fuels. Yes, it's true. There is this debate still going on in the United States about whether climate change results from human activity. For the scientific community, that debate was settled a long time ago. The climate is changing, and it's changing because we're burning fossil fuels. Now, we're also, by the way, at the beginning I mentioned the 3 Ds, debt, depletion, disaster. We're into the last of those 3 Ds right now. When I speak of disaster, I'm talking about weather events, but I'm also talking about industrial accidents, like the Deepwater Horizon. Why is this? We've always had industrial accidents, right? Well, as we dig deeper, as we have to search for oil, not just by, taking a sharpened stick and putting it in the ground, which is what we were doing in the 1860s and 70s to produce oil. But when we have to drill in a mile or 2 or 3 of ocean water using technology that's at the very limit of our capacity, then accidents are more likely to happen. And when they do happen, they're likely to be much, much worse than would have been the case otherwise. So that's what we're seeing. Same thing with Fukushima catastrophe in Japan. So we're seeing both natural disasters and industrial accidents that are more costly to society as time goes on. In 2010, the total cost of the flood in Pakistan, the drought in Russia and southwestern US, the Deepwater Horizon disaster, all of those things together was about $250 billion. This year, 2011, we passed the $250 billion mark in June. Every year we're setting a substantially higher record in terms of cost to society of industrial accidents and environmental disasters. Not only is that a direct cost, there are indirect costs implied by higher food prices and also by more risk to the system as a whole. That's why we have insurance companies to measure and insure against risk. And the insurance industry no longer knows how to value risk because weather events that used to be anticipated on a 100-year basis are now happening every 5 or 10 years. And we don't know where this is going. If we just follow out current trajectories, then industrial accidents and natural disasters alone in costs will wipe out economic growth within the next 10 or 20 years. So here we are. We're on a runaway train, the train of economic growth. It feels exhilarating. As the train speeds up, there's more money to go around, more jobs, higher returns on investments. So we naturally want the train to accelerate. As it accelerates, it's burning more fuel. It's spewing more pollution into the environment, but that's okay, because we know if the train were to stop, it would be terrible. So we want the train to speed up, and as long as the train is speeding up, everything is fine. If politicians can promise the train will speed up, we'll elect those politicians. The problem is, we live on a finite planet. Just as Hawaii is an island, Earth is an island as well. Beyond a certain point, there is no more opportunity for growth. Now, what we're seeing in the world financial system right now is a reluctant recognition of this fact. And I would say a very reluctant recognition. It's being called a growth crisis. This is a graphic by an economist named Charles Hugh Smith. And he's just lining up the dominoes of the European debt crisis, right? Well, why are all of these dominoes toppling? It's because governments and investment banks created enormous amounts of debt under the assumption that the economy would continue to grow, and as it did, tax revenues would grow, returns on investments would grow, and all of the debt would ultimately be repayable, right? But that's not what's happening. As growth slows down, suddenly all of that debt becomes like an anvil around the neck of the economy, pulling it down. So when I was researching this book, typically when I write books, I do most of my research as in literary form, reading current articles and books in the literature and so on. I did that again with this book, but I also interviewed a lot of people, dozens of people in the financial industry, policymakers, resource experts. Some of the people I talked to at length included the former managing director of JP Morgan, former vice president of Lehman Brothers, hedge fund managers, as well as retired national policymakers. So these conclusions, which are pretty gloomy, I have to agree with you, didn't come out of my imagination. This is what I heard again and again from very knowledgeable people, not only in the financial industry, but also government. We just went through a little bout in this country of Keynesian economic stimulus. The idea was if the government borrows and spends, then that'll trip us back into the growth mode, the natural growth mode of the economy. That didn't work all that well. We did have a short-term, fairly anemic recovery, but it was very, very expensive. It cost us several $1 trillion. Now we're about to try a different kind of experiment. There are those who say, well, the whole problem is too much government borrowing and spending, so if government cuts back on spending, then private enterprise will leap in and create jobs and more economic growth. We'll see how that works out. The experiment actually is already being tried in Greece and a few other countries. Austerity, of course, is cutbacks in spending and services, and wherever we're seeing it implemented, the result is increasing scarcity and poverty, declining tax revenues, and declining economic activity. So we'll see how that works out. The most likely result, I would suggest, is more social unrest. We've seen that begin to emerge over the past few weeks with the Occupy movement. And actually, I see the Occupy movement as being both inevitable and also very positive. Here in this country, I'm opinionizing now. This is my opinion. Our political system in this country has become sclerotic and corrupted. And when I say corrupt, usually that word is used to indicate a few bad actors breaking the rules. Well, what we've done in this country, and it's not unique, other countries have done the same thing throughout history. What we've done is we've taken things that used to be illegal within the financial system and within government, and we've made them legal. Within the financial system, things like the Glass-Steagall Act that used to prevent investment banks from doing commercial banking and vice versa. We broke down that firewall. We used to have prohibitions against corporations making certain kinds of campaign contributions for politicians. Those are gone. Those prohibitions are gone. So we have created a situation in which corruption is normalized. It's just the way we do governance in this country. If that's true, then it makes it very difficult to achieve the kinds of reforms that are actually needed in this, extraordinary moment in history by way of the usual electoral system. Wall Street, if in fact Wall Street rules the world, as that's a direct quote from a YouTube video that went viral of a young trader in London. He said, Goldman Sachs rules the world. Maybe so. If that's true, then how do you change the financial rules, which we desperately need to do? We need to make the financial system a much smaller part of the total economy, and we need to make primary production a much larger sector of the economy. How do we do that if Wall Street rules the world? Well, the only way out of that situation that I can see is to bring people out in the street and to demand fundamental change, which is what's happening. Well, what does all of this mean for Hawaii's economy? For an economy that's based primarily on tourism. It's not good. The prospects are not good. Once again, we're talking about more expensive transport fuels and a financial economy that's not likely to support more consumer debt. What does it mean for Hawaii's power grid? That depends, I've heard figures between 70% and 92% of your power grid based on burning of diesel fuel to generate electricity. I'm not sure what the exact figure is, but in that range, that's 85%, that's an enormous vulnerability. What does it mean for the whole project of globalization? There's this series of meetings taking place in Honolulu now, APEC, talking about further globalizing the economy of the Pacific region. How much does that make sense at this particular moment in history? Doesn't it make more sense to dramatically and rapidly transition Hawaii's grid system to renewable energy, reduce as much as possible reliance on liquid fuels for transport, localize the economy as much as possible, and especially starting with the food system? If 85% of food is imported, that's another enormous vulnerability. And not to bank on tourism as the linchpin of the economy going forward. We have to rethink the economic engine of this state. What is it going to be in the future, if not tourism? Well, chances are the answer to that question is going to be a kind of similar answer to the rest of the country and the rest of the world, which is, well, it's going to be a smaller economy. We can't assume economic growth. That doesn't mean it's the end of the world, however. We did just fine before we had economic growth. Remember, economic growth is an artifact of the 20th century. But it was a different kind of economy. It was an economy where, yes, there was innovation, new companies, new processes, new inventions were coming along all the time and outcompeting old ones, but the total size of the economy and the rates of consumption were relatively constant. That's what we have to aim for, because that's what we have in our future. Again, it's not the end of the world, but it's a different kind of economy. Now, I just mentioned population here. This is, of course, looking at the dramatic increase in population of urban Hawaii as opposed to the rest of Hawaii. I think we're likely to see a change in that trajectory in the near future. How much further can this curve go? So rather than planning for more population growth, shouldn't we also be planning for a change in that trend? We have to replace GDP with other kinds of measures. A lot of economists have agreed for decades that GDP is a perverse indicator. There are all sorts of things that make GDP go up that actually make life worse. Wars can make the GDP go up. So should we have more wars just to make the economy improve? People have done that before, actually. I wouldn't recommend it. But we could have a better life. See, what we've been doing over the past few decades is we haven't been actually aiming to make life better for people. We've been aiming to grow the economy. That has been the primary goal of policy, right? And generally speaking, it worked. We did grow the economy, but we didn't make life better for people. If you do cross-cultural psychological studies to find out where people are happiest, it turns out that in the countries where people are consuming the most energy and materials, well, yeah, people may be relatively happy, but they're not happier necessarily than people in countries that are consuming a tiny fraction of the energy and materials. There are lots of things that make people happy. The sense of community, of cooperation, of intergenerational solidarity, of culture, music, art, dance. Those things make people happy, but they don't cost much and they don't necessarily make the GDP go up, so we don't pay attention to them. If we started paying attention to them, we could have a better way of life even as consumption declines, which it will anyway. We need to build local resilience. What is resilience? It's the ability to absorb shocks and keep going. We have shocks on the way, and I'm sorry to say they're not far off in the distant future. They're coming soon, and they'll be very tough. So how do we absorb those shocks? Well, resilience is in most cases, the opposite of economic efficiency. I'm not talking about energy efficiency, but economic efficiency. Economic efficiency says if you can grow corn cheaper in Iowa than any place else, then you should grow all of your corn in Iowa and don't bother growing anything in Iowa except corn. Okay? So that gives you the cheapest corn you can possibly have, but it also gives you a food system that is not resilient. It's brittle, because if the corn crop in Iowa fails, nobody has corn. And, well, you can imagine the rest. So a resilient system typically has redundancies built into it, and also inventories. Economic efficiency tries to do away with inventories, just-in-time supplies, and reduce redundancy as much as possible. So local resilience, what does that mean? It means lots of people growing food for themselves. It means more self-reliance. It means more people occupying the same vehicles. You know, I think we're going to solve our transportation problem not by everybody buying a brand new $40,000 electric car, because I don't think very many of us are going to be able to afford to do that anytime soon. I think we're probably going to solve our transport problem by more people crowding into existing cars. You know, car share, ride share programs. As we do all of these things, we're going to have to reform economics itself. You know, economics as a discipline just grew up during this past century of rapid economic growth. And so most economists have internalized this phenomenon, and they believe that economic growth is normal and natural and it'll go on forever. But there are lots of other ideas that have become normalized within economics that need to be questioned. We need to understand that the economy, the human economy, is a subset of the environment, not the other way around. You know, the human economy ceases to function if we don't have a functioning ecosystem. Growth in population and consumption levels is fundamentally not sustainable. It can go on for a while, but not forever. Renewable resources have to be harvested at less than the rate of natural replenishment. You know, a 10-year-old child can understand some of these principles, but sometimes a trained economist has a little difficulty. Non-renewable resources have to be recycled as much as possible, and extraction of non-renewable resources has to decline. Okay, so those are basic economic principles. Now, can we follow those principles and still build these things? I don't know, is the answer to that question. I don't think anybody does. But how do we make these now? With depleting scarce materials, using virtually slave labor, using processes that are polluting the environments where production is occurring? How much longer can we continue to do that? I don't know. But certainly not in perpetuity. If we really like these gadgets, if we really think these are the coolest things in the world, then we got to figure out how to make them in a different way. I would suggest that, you know, every town and city should be thinking about developing a community economic laboratory that brings together, you know, credit union and food co-op, a job center, a free clinic, a car share program, all of these things that probably already exist in your community, but as alternatives. These need to become the mainstream. These will be the core of the new economy, rather than just nice little add-ons that we use the sustainable buzzword to refer to. And finally, I would say this overall transition in the economy is a very big deal. And perhaps in retrospect, we will see it as being as big a deal as any of the great transitions in human history. The development of fire, perhaps 3 or 4 million years ago, that enabled us to cook our food and to transform our environments. The development of language that enabled us to coordinate our behavior over space and time. Think about what it might have been like to bring down a mastodon without language. You know, but if you could coordinate, if you could say, well, now I'll be waiting in the bushes with this spear, so you chase the mastodon in this direction, and when it gets to this point, you know, language really has given us enormous power over our environment. The same thing with agriculture, which we developed only starting 10,000 years ago. Language maybe a few tens of thousands of years ago. Agriculture, which gave us cities, full-time division of labor, civilization itself, and then finally the Industrial Revolution. Okay, each of those great transitions enabled us to expand in population and in power over the environment. Now we are at the end of that trajectory. We're now at the point where we have to grow up as a species and recognize that there are limits and learn how to live within those limits. Rather than being the end of the world, I would regard this as the beginning of our maturity as a species. So I appreciate your thoughtful attention over these last few minutes, and hopefully we can have some discussion. Thanks very much.